Why the fuck would Max stay with Red Bull? Have they been sabotaging Tsunoda's car all along? Why have the upgrades made Leclerc slow? How has engine reliability gotten so good over the past few years? And most importantly, why are Renault so shit? We answer all of these questions and more in this episode of Your Biggest F1 Questions. I'm Jason Hassett. Welcome to Current and Combustion, and let's get to your questions straight from the dyno's mouth. Hello everybody and welcome to Your Biggest F1 Questions, where we're going to dive into, well, as the title says, your biggest F1 questions from the last week, which have been sent in either on Twitter, in the comments of this very channel, or Spotify if you're listening to it there, or have been texted to me by people I dislike but sadly have my number. So remember to go ahead into the comments and leave your biggest questions for next week. And while you're down there, why not drop an old sprinkle of like and a nice little bash of that subscribe button. Yeah, you know who you are. First question, straight from the dyno's mouth. Let's just mix them around a little bit so I don't get one that I don't want, hopefully. Box and stop. This one was actually sent in via Twitter on a response to the Blatantly Biased Racing podcast, and I will discuss it on that next week with Casual, but I wanted to answer it here as well because I think it's one that a lot of people share. So, do you agree now that Lando is nothing more than a glorified midfield driver? Great pace, sure, but everything else is mid. Well, we agree on certain things, but not others here, Box. The first one is an interesting one because, just to point out, I know, Box, you are a massive Oscar Piastri fan by your username on Twitter. And I would like to say this is an odd line of questioning from an Oscar Piastri fan, given that for the first two seasons that they were together, Norris dominated Oscar. And then so far this season, there's 16 points between them. Now, even if you took Silverstone into account, that would be 26. So for a glorified midfield driver not to be absolutely dominated by Oscar Piastri, it makes me wonder whether you have much faith in Oscar at all. It's an interesting one. But let's get into the main question. The simple fact is no. I think personally that he is not a glorified midfield driver. In fact, I think he's one of the top 5 or 6 drivers on the grid. I'm not going to give my exact order on that because on the Blatantly Biased Racing podcast, we're going to talk about the top 5 drivers right now in a couple of weeks during the summer break, and I'll answer it here in a couple of weeks if you want to. However, my point is that Lando Norris is definitely one of the best drivers on the grid right now, and in terms of pure pace, if we're just talking about pure outright pace, he's probably in the top 3, maybe top 4. And he definitely still has a slight edge on pace over Piastri at their limit, I think. But it's so cut. Like, it's so close that it's hard to call in reality. The problem with Lando is one of mentality in reality, because Oscar just has that absolutely locked down in a similar way to Verstappen, in that basically nothing gets under their skin. The reason I disagree with the premise of the question is that if Lando is a glorified midfield driver, then he's a very glorified one because of the current midfield drivers and of the midfield drivers when he was there, he was the best of those midfield drivers if you're putting him in that group. And by a fine margin, I would say, because he has beaten some very, very good midfield drivers. He's gone toe-to-toe with Carlos Sainz as a rookie. He beat Daniel Ricciardo quite handily, and he even managed to catch up with Ferrari's midfield driver, Lewis Hamilton, at a wonderful Austrian Grand Prix to grab his first podium. But the point is, he's just, in terms of pace alone, obviously, he's not a midfield driver. In terms of how he goes racing on track, he's far from a midfield driver. And in terms of his consistency and just race wins since McLaren started winning, he's not a midfield driver. In fact, he's got the same amount of race wins as Oscar Piastri, and they've been in a race-worthy car for the same amount of time. So I concede to you that, simply put, if Lando is a glorified midfield driver, then so is Oscar, frankly. That's the only argument you can make. And I don't think Oscar is by any means a glorified midfield driver. In fact, I think Oscar is one of the few drivers on the grid who could definitely go toe-to-toe with Max Verstappen over a season. And again, let's get to the bashing of Lando Norris, because he certainly deserves some. The simple fact is, Lando is one of the top tier drivers on the grid. Again, I would argue top 5 or 6. We'll get into that later. He has the pace. I think we both agree on that. I think everyone agrees on that. In terms of racecraft and aggression when it comes to overtaking, he does have that. And we've seen that in the past. I go back to the move on Monza a couple of years ago where he lunged it onto the grass to overtake Leclerc. He has gone toe-to-toe with most drivers on the grid and been fine. The problem Lando has is just the pressure getting to him. And I think this is where top tier drivers, we haven't seen how the rest of them will perform. We know Leclerc can deal with it under pressure because we saw it in 2022. Unfortunately, he's driving for Ferrari, which makes it impossible to win. We don't know where Russell, Antonelli, Hamilton in the ground effect era, we don't know where the other top tier drivers stand in terms of under that level of pressure. And to be fair, up until in reality, the kind of run from Max last year, Lando did pretty well. And I mean, there was a few races where he was dominating last year as well. So the problem he has is when it comes to just those fine margins, those ultimate pieces of pressure, he caved against Max. But haven't most drivers in reality caved under that pressure from Max so far? Pretty much all of them, and it's not always either. It's not like it's every weekend. So do I think that Lando is likely to beat Oscar Piastri outright for a championship? No. And the reason I don't think so is because I think that Oscar has the edge when it comes to keeping his cool, which I think will absolutely play to his strengths, over the season. But let's think about it a different way. If it wasn't Oscar in the car, if it was a Daniel Ricciardo, a Carlos Sainz, an Antonelli even at the moment, if it was anyone else on the grid in that McLaren alongside Lando, except for Russell, Hamilton, Max, obviously, Oscar Piastri, and Leclerc, and Alonso, obviously. Anyone except those top tier drivers, right? Lando is walking a championship this year. Simple as. He's just walking it this year. Those are the only drivers that could give him a challenge, and the only one we are 99.9% sure will absolutely beat him in that situation so far is Max. We know Max would beat him in that car because Max has done it already. I'm pretty sure Russell would because of how I've seen Russell perform, and I'm pretty sure Oscar will because of how I've seen him perform. I'm also fairly sure Leclerc would because I just think Leclerc has better, wheel-to-wheel racing, but then we've only seen Leclerc fail at Ferrari. And Leclerc hasn't been able to win a championship before, but he hasn't had the car for it. Leclerc also has been in Ferrari for a long time now and has the same amount of race wins as Norris. So are we saying Leclerc is a glorified midfield driver? Because in terms of stats and ability to deliver and times they've thrown away points, Leclerc and Norris are similar. And I don't think anyone thinks Leclerc is a glorified midfield driver. So look, if the question is Norris a top tier championship contender? I don't know, is the honest answer. And he doesn't seem to be. He seems to lack that last kind of final 1%. But the simple fact is he's definitely a top tier driver because against, 75% of the grid, he beats them hands down in a championship, which means he's not a glorified midfield driver. Simple as. And at the end of the day, he's very, very close to Oscar right now. So I think we have to either go, he's not, or both he and Oscar are, because there's not that much between them. So answer me that in the comments. Okay, next question. All right, let's see what we got next here. Vlad asks, why should I use a VPN? And what's the best one? What an interesting question, Vlad. When you're racing around the internet at full speed, who is protecting you from hackers, trackers, and those pesky digital DRS zones? That's where my favorite VPN, NordVPN, comes in. Think about it like the security cell for your life, keeping your chassis safe and you protected, while keeping you anonymous and, importantly for Formula One fans, blisteringly fast. Whether you're just trying to stream races while you're abroad or watching motorsports like an odd weirdo in a field as I would, or just want to keep your data safe from shady sponsorship deals a la the 90s in F1, NordVPN locks it all down for you, keeping you safe behind your own shiny pit wall. But the paddock secret is you can get it right now for 77% off a 2-year deal, plus 4 months extra for free using my link, nordvpn.com/Hassett. And unlike some of those 90s shady sponsorship deals, if you don't like it, you can get your money back within 30 days. So hey, Ferrari might not be able to protect their drivers from shoddy race strategies, but you can sure as hell protect yourself online with NordVPN. Now back to the next question. Let's see. Why was Lewis slower after the Ferrari upgrade, says Mark. Well, here's the simple one. It's not so much that he was slower. Obviously, they brought their new suspension. They're dealing with that, dealing with everything, and getting on top of that. But it doesn't seem to be the new suspension that is causing the problem for them. And the only thing about that is we're going to have to see over the next couple of races whether he's struggling with the suspension or not. What has been reported is that while there wasn't an upgrade as such on the car, they did switch the brakes. Now, this is technically an upgrade, but it's just not listed as one as far as I'm aware. And Leclerc got this in Canada from all the reporting we've seen. I haven't confirmed this personally. I haven't bothered to, but there's been some good reporting from the race, and they are pretty much convinced that he's got new Brembo brakes instead of the ones they were using before. And Leclerc has had these since Canada. So we're going to take that at the word. Now, if that is the case, that would explain why Hamilton was very comfortable and confident in the race, but seemed to just go absolutely nowhere in qualifying. Didn't seem that confident in the sprint, and went off the track a couple of times, silly lockups, silly spins and stuff like that. I think this is one excuse that you could give Lewis Hamilton here. I personally am tired of excuses, and if you watch the podcast, you probably know that I'm just saying, like, look, enough of the excuses. It's time to just adapt, because it's been 4 seasons now of just not being able to adapt, getting beaten by George Russell, going to Ferrari, and just giving the same excuses over and over again. And I'm just tired of it, to be honest. And it's just this constant blaming the team, blaming upgrades, instead of going, look, I'm just not adapting. So I don't want to come across here as like pandering to Hamilton fans, but I do think realistically this is one, and I'll explain in a minute why, where you could give him a little bit of slack. The reason why is when it comes to these drivers, the brakes are one of the most important things in the world. In fact, when it comes to racing in general, ironically, brakes make you faster. The reason for that is obvious, in that if you can slow down quicker, get through the traction or get to the traction zones quicker and take off again, obviously you're going to win. If you can brake later, you're going to be able to overtake better. All of these things that we don't need to get into are obvious as to why brakes are so important. The simple fact is that they changed his brakes to ones that clearly are much more powerful from what's been talked about. And like I said, I'm taking it at the word that he's just got them this weekend and that the excuse is valid. Maybe it's wrong. But yeah, it seems like these Brembo brakes that they've got, these new ones, are much, much more potent. In Canada, Leclerc did seem to struggle with braking. I think he had a spin as well and a few lockups and so on. So maybe there is something to it. And it would make sense because when you think about it, these drivers, when it comes to driving these cars, are always trying to figure out what the limit is. And you don't want to be thinking that. You're doing it through feel. Think about yourself as well. When you jump from your car into another person's car as well, the clutch and the brakes, it always takes you a couple of minutes to kind of get on top of them because the clutch bite or the braking point is always a little bit different in each car. Now imagine trying to figure that out when you're doing 200 miles an hour in a very sensitive braking system, kind of left and right. You know, your left foot braking, very sensitive. You need to do it right at the limit. You're coming down from 200 miles an hour. Brake sensitivity is so important. And if you're going from brakes that weren't as potent to brakes that are, that's obviously going to upset you a little bit. Now, the thing that we have to put on Lewis here is he has been struggling, he says, and he's been talking about, with braking zones, you know, not being able to brake as late, not having as much confidence in the car and so on. This should improve that and should get rid of a lot of the excuses for qualifying in the race. So if he comes back and says, I'm not able to brake as late and so on, the excuse is gone now when it comes to the brakes, because him and Leclerc are on similar brakes. So there's no more excuses when it comes to that. But I think we can cut him a little bit of slack this weekend, to be fair. All right, next question straight from the dyno's mouth. Let's get into it. Phil says, why were Red Bull holding out on Tsunoda? So this is from the talk, obviously, that Tsunoda hasn't been on the exact same spec as Verstappen. He's been lagging behind for quite a while now. And at this weekend's Grand Prix, between the sprint and qualifying, he got upgraded to the latest floor and then was immediately much closer to Verstappen in qualifying than he was over the last few races. And it caused a lot of questions, especially given that they gave him the new floor, but they didn't give him the new front wing. And therefore, obviously it does seem like kind of preferential treatment, and it's making the second driver seem worse than they actually are. And all of this, so basically it's like, why were they holding out? And then I guess another part not mentioned in this, obviously, is, why are they doing this all of a sudden now, just handing stuff over now that Horner's gone, for example? Now, the first thing to say is this isn't a new thing. Horner actually did this in Canada as well. He swapped over a new floor unexpectedly to Tsunoda to help with his confidence there and got him up to a newer spec, but not with all the specs in common. The reality is the reason that they hold these back is this is a very Verstappen-centric team. And obviously they want to be sure that they can score the most points with Verstappen each weekend because he is the de facto team leader. So simply put, if you have only one spare, then it makes sense to kind of hold that out and not give that to Tsunoda in order to make sure there is a spare for if Verstappen gets damaged in qualifying, for example, or something along those lines, where it will then immediately, I don't even know if you can swap them back, but even if you could, it would immediately put Tsunoda into Parc Fermé instead of just losing a few places and whatever and so on. However, it seems like Mekies is pretty hell-bent now on just giving the two of them the same setup. I don't know whether it's Mekies or Red Bull or whether he'll maybe get scolded for that decision by Jos Verstappen afterwards. But personally, I think this is a situation where, at Canada and up, maybe before Canada, it's like up until Spain, was it when they brought the new... Was Canada before or after Spain? Someone correct me in the comments there. I can't remember already. But basically, before they brought the new FlexiWing update in, Verstappen's team and Horner and Red Bull were still not 100% sure whether they were in this title fight going on. They were very, very hopeful that, things would change with that upgrade, with that technical directive coming in. So I think it does kind of make sense that Horner was trying to ensure that Verstappen was happy, because if Verstappen went at that point, he knew he was in trouble. Turns out it didn't matter, but at that point, he was probably thinking, right, if we can turn this around and keep Verstappen in the championship, then we'll be fine. And I guess the simple thinking was, look, the second driver's still getting to grasp with it. He's not on top of it. He's more likely to crash and damage a part anyway. So keeping him back until we have a spare for Verstappen is just pragmatic. And I guess now, and maybe it was after Canada as well, after the TD, I cannot remember. I think Canada was after Spain. I think it was the week after, but I may be wrong there. I do these off the top of my head, as you can probably tell. It just, by that point then it's kind of like, right, look, the championship is starting to go here, so let's just forget about it. But definitely now it does seem like they have kind of decided, look, this championship is over with. I think everyone kind of agrees with that position anyway. So it makes more sense now to kind of hand over parts. Again, I'll be interested to see what Jos Verstappen's thinking is on that, giving any sort of preference to the other side of the garage. But it makes sense that they would do this now. So I think it, I do wonder, would this have happened if Horner was still around, given he'd probably still be in the position of trying to dangle the board and kind of Verstappen's camp, but I guess that's not a problem anymore. The interesting part will be if they have the new front wing next week, or when they come back from the summer break, will they have them on equal parts to see whether Tsunoda is closer? Because the difference in qualifying after they upgraded that part was relatively substantial. There could be more to it than just one part. We don't want to just, correlation is not causation. We don't want to jump to conclusions, but it is an interesting one. So I think it will be interesting to see why. But to answer the blunt question, the simple fact is, I think before they were in a title fight, or at least they were hoping to be. Now they're not, and Horner's gone. So Mekies at least has some leash, and he's probably looking for anything to show that he's making improvements. And that is probably a good way to do it, especially given the fact that, they had clearly already, in my opinion, by that stage, locked Max down, which I believe is a question we have later on anyway. But yeah, it makes pragmatic sense. But yeah, it was a weird one with how much he caught up. Wasn't really much of an answer to that. Sorry. Let's get to the next one. Buddy Bill 8551 says, why are Renault so shit? This was a great one that he actually has two questions in here. I know there's another one coming. But I did say I would answer this one at some point, but I said it would probably need an 8-hour podcast. But we won't get into that one. The simple fact is, though, if I could lay it out, why are Renault so shit is, well, Renault is in a even more precarious situation than, say, a Ferrari or, Red Bull now, or, any other team that kind of has to answer very short term to a board. Ferrari has been in this situation for a long time, since they got rid of, or since Jean Todt left, basically, where the team principal is constantly at the behest of the board. Now, every team principal that isn't an owner, or co-owner like Toto Wolff, is kind of at the behest of the board. But normally what happens is a board, like in the case of McLaren, for example, will have a long-term plan and have long-term goals, and will kind of allow the team principal, the CEO, to go through some of those goals and go, look, we know this is a long-term project. We know things don't happen overnight in F1. And we're going to give you a long leash. And if you continue to fail for, 3-4 years, then fair enough. It's time to start talking about it. I think realistically 5 years, depending on where the team is. But instead, you've got teams like, Ferrari, like Renault, who just turn over every year or two as soon as things aren't working, or as soon as it's not on track for 3 months. And the board basically comes in and says, look, we have to tell the shareholders something, and you haven't done anything in 6 months, so we've got to fire you now. This is what I fear is going to start happening with Red Bull, but that's a different conversation. But it's been happening at Ferrari for a long time, and it's been happening at Alpine Renault for a long time. Now, the reason I say Renault is in an even more precarious situation is, while Ferrari is a publicly traded company, it is kind of majority private held. Shareholders and so on are, well, in general, shareholders are private entities of public companies. Renault, on the other hand, is 50% owned by the French state. So it's a semi-state company. And therefore, they have to be answerable to people who haven't actually bought in. People who just pay taxes, and these taxes are being invested on their behalf. So they have to be even more scrutinous of this situation. That's an unfortunate position for a company to be in. And in the past, when they've been in that situation, things have turned around relatively quickly. They've had very, very, not so much it's the good management, but they've had management that has been very bullish. And that, I think, is where Flavio has come in. And I don't think it's going to work this time, but that is where Flavio's come in, unless Horner takes over. The simple fact is, the board has basically thrown the baby out with the bathwater every 18 months, a la Red Bull now, as soon as things start going wrong. It's much more complex than that, and there is more detail than that on terms of they haven't been willing to invest, upgrade, they've let the wrong people go, they haven't put the right people in charge. It's a detailed one that I would love to cover on the Blatantly Biased Racing podcast. But I think if we look at the crux of it, it's that they put the right people in charge for a short period of time. And to give a quick, very 2-minute overview of that, you had Fred Vasseur, the current team boss of Ferrari, came in for 1 season and was so politically hamstrung by the Renault board, by the higher-ups, the CEOs, that he just said, I can't deal with this anymore. And then for some reason went to Ferrari, but that's a different story. You then had Cyril, who stuck around for a while. And if you look at Cyril's run, they may not have won the championship, but they were consistently moving up, getting a little bit better, moving up. Then he went in the toilet. They brought in Otmar, Immediately things didn't go up, got rid of them. So yeah, like that for me is the main point. And what they need to do is fix it to have consistent leadership for at least 5 or 6 years to see things go up. And it has to be realistic ambitions. And that's the main reason Renault are shit, basically. Thank you for the question. I know it's not fully detailed, but I probably will do a podcast on like the history of Renault with Casual or something. So stay tuned for that one. Next question. Oh, Buddy Ball 8551. I knew there was 2 in here. Didn't expect to get both of them in a row. Obviously, I'm not going to go into huge detail with this one because it's an incredibly detailed one, but I'm going to give you the cliff notes. What has changed with engine reliability over time, and what causes the engine to lose power? So this is because obviously at the moment I think he says he was a new fan as well, if I remember correctly, who's been watching for a year or so. So welcome to F1. Love that you're into the technical stuff like me. Really do enjoy that side of it way more than the drivers personally, which irks a lot of people. But yeah, look, to give you the brass tacks on it, obviously Formula One has gone through massive changes since the 90s, for example, when cars were heavily unreliable. The 2000s still very unreliable, but not as much. And over the last decade or so, cars have gotten way, way, way more reliable. And over the last 3-4 years, incredibly reliable. Now, to give you the quick overview of why they've been so reliable recently, the simple fact of reliability recently is that's the only way to upgrade these engines at the moment until 2026. So from 22 to now, until 2026 starts, the reason for the absolutely bulletproof reliability, where we're seeing very few issues outside of Williams, is that for the most part, all of the teams have been running the same engine since 2022, and the only upgrades you're allowed are for reliability. So when you're not pushing performance, the best way to get performance is to make them more reliable, and therefore you can put them under more load without them going bang and so on. So that's why they've been ultimately just so reliable over the last few years, because the engines haven't been changing and the teams haven't been pushing for performance. So when they're pushing for performance and pushing them to the limits, they're not quite sure where that limit is. And therefore you're going to go over it, you're going to overheat, you're going to break it and so on, and you're going to lose the engine. So over the last 2-3 seasons, since you've been watching, if I remember correctly from the comment, that's why you're seeing like just bulletproof reliability, because the engines have been under a freeze since 2022 other than reliability. So teams aren't pushing for just raw performance. Therefore, they understand the limits and they're just trying to fix those so they can kind of push at those limits more often, essentially. Whereas before that, they're not sure about the limits. They're always pushing, they're always upgrading, and you're bound to kind of, have overheating problems, compression problems with the turbos and so on when you're constantly kind of pushing into the unknown limits of performance. So in order to explain, like, for example, over the last 15 years, we have had reliability issues, but they've been less so for a couple of reasons. One is that the teams obviously is a simpler way to go back. No, okay. You know what it is, actually. Let me just jump back for a second and explain how they've become more reliable really quick. So the simplest way to explain is in the 90s and 2000s, obviously the teams didn't have a lot of telemetry, sensors, and data and computation in the way we do now. So they were never quite sure where those limits were. They were just kind of pushing them, running them on dynos, getting a good idea, but not really sure where the main causes of failures were. So it was a lot of trial and error, and they would essentially worry more about performance than they would worry about reliability. Christian Horner famously used to say, "Give me a fast, unreliable car any day over a reliable, slow one, because you can slowly fix reliability, and I would rather have a fast car that goes bang occasionally and pop in some good results." Also, back in the 90s, 2000s, you had less points per race as well. So some big scores throughout the season were more important, and that's the way teams would focus on it. So a couple of reliability issues wouldn't be a huge issue. And if you go even further back, in the 90s as well, I think early 90s, you only counted the top 6 or 7 results from the season. So at the end of the day, you'd have 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 races, but you'd only include a certain amount of them. So you wouldn't be worried if you went bang a certain few times, if you could be really punchy and fast for a few of them. That also brings into the fact that back in those days, the teams would also, especially the teams that had a lot of money, so the bigger teams, your McLarens, your Ferraris, Red Bulls, obviously not till 2005, but you'd have BMW, Williams had a lot of money back in the day, for example. Under the regulations, you could run a new engine every race. You could, at a certain point, run a new engine every session. So the teams didn't really care about how much load they put on the engine because it would literally be used for one race, or at points coming into the 2000s, one race weekend. In fact, it was 1 to 2 race weekends by the mid 2000s, if I believe. And it was only 2009, 2010, I think it was 2010, where they started bringing in some cost measures to help the smaller teams, that they decided that you would have to run an engine for at least 5 or 6 races. At the moment, it's kind of every 7 or 8 races because it's 3 engines per season without taking a penalty. And as soon as that happened, you had to worry about reliability because you only had a set amount of engines per season. The final part on this is that when we look at the older cars, the minimum weights were a lot lower. So you were always focusing to get your car as light as possible. Reliability means having tougher pieces, meaning having kind of heavier pieces in general. And therefore, you would rather have a much lighter, much faster car than a more reliable one and just hope that the engine doesn't go bang at the worst time, essentially. Nowadays, the cars are so heavy and the minimum weights are so high that in reality, you have a lot of space and capacity once you shave things off to add weight in engine reliability anyway. So that's kind of the rough idea of it. I think it's a great idea to go into maybe this for like a story time episode after I'm finished covering like Porsche and Lambo and everything. But yeah, I hope that gives you a rough idea of kind of how things change or why they change. But essentially, 2010 onwards, reliability became much more of a focus than it was before because you only had a set limit of engines per season. Whereas before that, you could change your engine at the most every 2 races. Or sorry, at the least every 2 races, at the most every session at points. So it wasn't that big of a deal. Yeah, and also the sensors and technology and so on. But thanks for the question. I really appreciate it. And thank you for watching. Killian says, why is Aston a tractor again? Yeah. So obviously this is to do with the fact that they brought major, like a very big upgrade package to the Spa Grand Prix weekend. And they were absolutely pretty much the slowest car over the whole weekend. Now, I do think part of this is there has been a complaint from Alonso that the car has been incredibly slow in the straights over the course of the season. It's been incredibly slow in the kind of high-speed sections in general anyway. So I do think this is just one of those weekends where, they bring a load of upgrades, but it was slow anyway. So it's hard to kind of fix the setup, fix all those issues, and you're not really going to have like a Spa and Monza spec wing specifically if you're kind of just correlating things anyway. So I don't think the upgrades have much to do with it. I think this was always going to be a bad weekend for them in general. But yeah, they were much worse than I expected them to be. If I'm honest, I would probably put it down to the fact that they probably knew this was going to be a shit weekend for them anyway. And they kind of decided to just, make the best of a bad situation and turn it into a weekend testing session. That would make sense to me, given that this is a team that is very much focused on 2026. And Nui's want with the 2025 car is to essentially ensure that all of the thinking and thought processes, as well as all of the process with their wind tunnel, CFD, everything else, simulator, all correlates to on-track performance, which has been a major issue for the Aston Martin team, especially with their new facilities. So I would say that, this is probably not a huge concern for the team. In general, this season's written off anyway, and it just remains to be seen. We'll see over the next few races when we go to Hungary, and then when we come back from the off season, if these upgrades have done anything. But the question I would have for the team and the question I want answered is, even if these upgrades, maybe didn't give you a huge boost in performance, have they helped with balance, or, basically what you expected from them in the wind tunnel and the CFD, has that carried over to the track? Maybe not for this weekend, but in general. And if not, has it at least given you some insights as to why? And at the end of the day, this 2025 season isn't being worked on by Nui. Nui is having lunchtime meetings with them. They're very much just using this to ensure that all their tools and systems and processes are ready for the 2026 car. So, yeah, as for why it's a tractor, I think it was always going to be this weekend. And I think when you lump upgrades onto it, unknowns, more variables, less time to do setups, sprint weekend, I think it was always going to be a nightmare. So I don't think it's that concerning for the Aston Martin team. Tim gets right down to business with this one. Why the fuck would Max stay at Red Bull? Well, it's a strong question, but yes, we finally got confirmation from Helmut Marko, from sources I know, as well as sources that the race know, who I trust more than myself, that Max is in fact staying at least for 2026. The tidbit here, though, is that it seems like he didn't really have a choice in terms of buyout because he was within the top three, and apparently it has been relatively confirmed that the exit clause was that by the end of this month, basically after the Hungarian Grand Prix, he would have to be outside the top three. There's 28 points between him and George, so there's just no chance for that to happen after Belgium. But next season, it's outside the top two, which is a huge ask for Red Bull. So that's going to be the interesting one. Now, the reason I said it was never going to happen anyway is because as soon as we found out that that clause was in place, it's over, because realistically, even if Toto and Mercedes are willing to pay the reported $102 million buyout, if that is the case, Red Bull would also have to accept that. And I think Red Bull would rather have Verstappen than 102 million at the moment, given that it seems like that's the reason they fired Horner. I know correlation is not causation, as I like to say, as the saying goes. But this, once again, and the way this has been reported, the way, Max talked about things at Spa, the way Helmut's talked about 2026, this all tells me that I just don't buy the bullshit from Red Bull, to be honest. And that the reason Horner was fired is that the Verstappen camp were very much pushing this as one of the reasons, or like one of the changes they wanted. I'm not saying it was the only change. I'm sure their focus was on performance as a whole, but I do think that Horner kind of was lumped in with performance, according to Jos Verstappen, at least. Maybe not Max himself. And I kind of don't think with Max himself, to be fair. I've very much given him the benefit of the doubt on this one. But yeah, that's that side of it. He is staying. I think they've made a huge mistake by thinking short term on a driver instead of a team boss who can turn it around. But hey, if they want to be, more in control of a midfield team instead of less in control of a winning one, that's fine. Red Bull Austria. Although this channel has been called the Horner Fanboy channel, and I'm not helping that, am I? To all the Dutch fans watching. But yeah, as for the question itself, why would Max stay at Red Bull? The thing is, I'm in two minds on this one, right? Because in some ways, it's a pragmatic choice to stay, because you're gambling either way. If you stay, you're gambling, that Red Bull's going to fall apart and that you're going to be sitting back watching someone else win a title next year. But if you move to Mercedes, you're gambling as well, because Mercedes may have the best engine next year. That's still unknown, even though we're all kind of expecting it to be. But they haven't been able to build a decent car, or at least don't seem to understand how to build a decent car in the ground effect era. And while the new era is very different, it still uses ground effect. It still uses kind of somewhat Venturi tunnels. And it's an even more complex set of regulations that involves active aero. So, can they build a better car? That's a gamble as well. So I think in many ways it is pragmatic to stay, see the lay of the land, and then move, in a similar way to what Vettel did. Of course, he was coming off the back of, success. It was obvious for him to stay for 2014 with Red Bull because everything told him that Red Bull would know what they're doing, whereas this is a less certain Red Bull. But I do think it is the pragmatic choice, because you just don't know where the chips will lie next year. The only thing I will say is, I think it's pretty, I would bet money, and I'm pretty conclusively going to say that Red Bull has just done something that has caused every team in F1 history to slip back down the order and take years to come back in firing a long-time successful team principal. Like Jean Todt left, wasn't fired as such. Stefano had a little bit of success, but that was very much, built on where the team was at the time anyway. So Lauren may, if they've turned things around for 2026 and they had good things in place, he may get lucky that things were set up there and he can just kind of calm everything down. But generally speaking, like Ron Dennis, things again, that's a fair one actually, because Ron Dennis, things were falling apart under him anyway. So if you want to correlate something, look at McLaren. You may say, well, look at where McLaren is now, but look at how long that took. Ron Dennis officially stepped down in 2015, if I remember correctly. We're in 2025 now, talking a decade before he came back. Williams still haven't come back to the front. You're talking the 90s. Ferrari is Jean Todt in 2006, 2007. Stefano took over in 2007, 2008. I can't remember. Maybe it's 2008. Someone correct me on that. But around that time, they still haven't come back. McLaren took a long time, as I've already mentioned. And, no one else on the grid has come back from losing a long-term team principal. Alpine, for example, haven't come anywhere near. So just historically speaking, it's going to go downhill. That's where I don't understand what Max is thinking, because not only is that history there, not only are we going into a situation where, if you were to look at who you think will do it the best with engines, it's not going to be Red Bull. You would assume. Maybe they'll play a blinder. Maybe they will. But Honda have experience delivering title-worthy engines. Mercedes have experience delivering engines that perform even in this era. It's the same era technically, but you know what I mean. Ferrari deliver great engines unless they get caught cheating, generally speaking. Ferrari very rarely have an engine problem other than, again, 2020, where there was a little old slap on the wrist. And while Audi obviously haven't been in Formula One in the past to give us that track record, Audi have a track record in a lot of other series that tell you they know how to build an engine. Red Bull starting from scratch. So you would assume that of all those teams, Red Bull's going to be the hardest pressed, right? They have pulled a load of team from HPP, from Mercedes, HPP. Maybe that'll help them. They have learned a lot from Honda. Maybe that'll help them. So maybe it could be wrong. But just those chips are already stacked. And then on top of that, you've got board intervention, a board properly pulling the strings, and a new team principal who is very much at the behest of the board now. An inexperienced, he has experience, but inexperience in this role at running a team like this. And then that causes and throws into chaos all of the fact that there doesn't seem to be much confidence in Vache either. And they could well still drop him out and bring Eggins in it. So while it's a gamble to stay with Red Bull, while it's a gamble to go to Mercedes, I think it's an even bigger gamble to stay with Red Bull. And I would be certain that while I wouldn't be sure that Mercedes can deliver a title-winning car next year, I'm pretty damn sure Red Bull won't. Maybe I'll be proven wrong. I'm pretty sure they won't. Now, for those of you who are saying, yeah, but he'll just wait and he'll go wherever he wants in 2027. Again, history tells us not to be so sure. If Aston are winning, sure, he's going to be able to jump in there, I think, without problem. Newey likes him. Whether Newey will kind of, want Jos to come over, I don't think that's an issue, but I'm just saying won't be a problem, I don't think. I think that's not an issue. But if Mercedes are winning, I think that could be more of an issue. Because next year, if they're winning the title, Max will not have won a title in 2 seasons by the point that, or won't be on track to have won his second title. Because if Mercedes are winning, let's say, if Mercedes are absolutely dominant next year, or it's Mercedes v McLaren, right? You'll be in a situation where it really depends. Like Max's entire dependence is in the hands of Antonelli. Because in reality, if Mercedes have a car that can win the title next year, George is going to be there. I don't care how you feel about it. I'm 99% sure on that. Look at how he's delivering this season. He is well capable of delivering a title. So if Mercedes have the right car next year, George is there. And then it depends on where Antonelli delivers. Because if Antonelli steps up his game next year, then why would Toto want to pay big bucks for Verstappen when he's got two drivers who can deliver and he doesn't need to upset the status quo? He doesn't need a Rosberg-Hamilton situation. He's already got a situation where both drivers kind of work well together and he's pulling the strings, and he has more than likely a title winning, like already a world champion in the car by the end of the season. I know you might say, oh yeah, but it's Verstappen. But again, it was Vettel for, he had all the options in the world. It's not like Hamilton jumped to a title winning car after 3 seasons of a mess in Mercedes. He didn't have all the options in the world. Like Red Bull weren't jumping at Hamilton when he was thinking about leaving Mercedes, Maybe they were, who knows? But we know they reached out and Horner didn't really want to go down that route. For example, he didn't need to, he had Verstappen. But the point is, I don't know, when you're winning, when you have the winning car and you've got a champion in the car already, and you've got a guy that you think is the future, do you really want to bring a guy in who's already talking about retiring and so on? I'm not so sure. And I think if McLaren are in the situation where they've got Piastri, who's likely won a title this year, Norris, who ends close, those guys worked well together. Either way, he's not going there if McLaren are winning. So by not moving now, it may not be as cut and dry as just picking a team for 2027. I know Verstappen fans are going to say, yeah, but it's Verstappen. But I've been watching long enough to see, multiple world champions not being able to get into a seat at the right time because that team has their shiny new champion. They have a car that can win. So why do they need a Verstappen then? At the moment they do, but they may not in 12 months. It's a big gamble. I think a bigger gamble was to kick out Horner, but it's a big gamble. And finally, last question. Fred says, will they even fix the dirty air? Is this? It is. Well, okay. Fred says, will they ever fix the dirty air? Personally, I don't think so. Because I think the problem is it's the FIA trying to fix the dirty air. And the simple fact is, we saw in 2022 that when dirty air goes away, we get some absolutely banger racing. The cars don't look as good, they look slower, but the racing is great, and that's all everyone cares about. Max and Leclerc going toe-to-toe was brilliant. Obviously, part of that was the cars were relatively close as well. All that helps, but the dirty air meant they could fight lap after lap after lap. We still saw that to an extent in 2023 in the midfield while Max was on a vacation 4 million miles up the road. But then the dirty air started kicking really into place in 24. And this year, it's been a nightmare. Spa shows that to an extent that is unbelievable. But dirty air has been a real problem for a long time now. And when I started properly watching in the early to mid 2000s, dirty air was already a conversation that everyone was talking about in terms of, this is becoming a real problem. How do we clamp down on this? The problem is that realistically, the FIA, first of all, has to design something that it thinks will fix dirty air. The simple fact is the engineers at these teams, at the big teams, the 1,000 engineers that outnumber the engineers at the FIA are way smarter anyway, and they don't really give a shit about dirty air. They're just trying to build the fastest car, and therefore they're just going to go down every route, no matter what it does to the turbulence behind. So the FIA would have to outsmart the F1 team's engineers, which is just never going to happen. That's the first thing. The second thing is the FIA has absolutely collapsed to pressure from the F1 teams over this generation by allowing them to just remove objects that have been there to help with dirty air in the first place. Obviously, we had the kind of rounded off edges to the rear wings, which they get rid of because the teams complained about performance and so on and so forth. And, you get more vortices at the back, more dirty air. They've allowed more and more aerodynamic devices, aerodynamic changes, aerodynamic loopholes to be exploited. And they've just let them run amok. And of course, the dirty air is going to get worse instead of clamping down on it. And then worse than that, they bowed to the pressure of the F1 teams and the FOM by allowing new manufacturers coming in to dictate how the 2026 regulations would go, instead of taking all the learnings from this one and coming up with an absolutely brilliant set of regulations for 2026, which focused primarily on the racing. Instead, they focused primarily on the engine and then worked everything else around that, which is probably going to give us shit racing, even though we won't have a huge dirty air problem, I don't think, for the first season, because the engineers won't be able to exploit everything, etc., etc. I think there is personally only one solution to the dirty air problem in Formula One, and that is simply to put it back on the teams. The same way they did in 1994 after Senna's death with safety. The planks came in, all of these tests came in, and it was squarely put on the teams. We are putting a device at the bottom of your car. If you ride it too low, if you ride it and you, put too much downforce on your car, that's your problem. You're disqualified. All of the rest came in. The safety tests, the technical regulations to check things like, were teams running in shady ways? All of these things they put back on the team. These are the legal limits. You figure out how to run inside them. Not our problem. We should do the same thing for dirty air. It's the only solution. Okay. The simple fact is we can implement it in one way or the other. And if it's costly, so be it. It's everything in Formula One is costly. I don't know what the exact metric is. I haven't really thought that out, and I'm not the right person to. I'm not an aerodynamic engineer. But the simple fact is they know from testing from sensors roughly the percentage of loss of downforce from the car behind, for example, that they tell us about all the time. They said they were reducing downforce by 35% before, it was 15%. They have ways of calculating the loss, right? So I think there's a few ways you can do it. You either have sensors on the front wings of the cars behind, which I think is probably a bad way, because you don't want any sort of way in which a competitive team could do something to make it look like a team ahead is breaking the dirty air limit, for example. But my point is, have some sort of hard dirty air limit. This is the amount of dirty air you are allowed to produce. And if you go over it, you're disqualified from the race, in the same way that if you wear your plank down. There's a few ways you could implement this, as I said. Sensors on the front of the following cars, or of all cars, to check what happens when they get into the turbulence. I guess you just have to be very, very, careful about ensuring that the teams aren't playing with these to get other teams disqualified. That's the only worry I'd have there. An easier way would be sensors on the back of your car. Obviously, if you tamper with those, you're disqualified anyway. So all those things should be able to be checked, going back to both of those. But the simplest solution for me is the air rakes that the teams run during testing could simply be put on, after Parc Fermé. So the teams do installation laps to the grid. The teams do kind of a test lap. You could put them on, at the start of qualifying. So each team has to put a rake on before they start qualifying. They do a run around, and then you're in Parc Fermé. And we then have all the data and, oh, look, sorry, you've broken Parc Fermé now. You have to fix that and test it again before the race. Whatever it may be, at the end of a race, you get the team to do one run with it. It could be implemented. But I think, look, the brass tacks is, as long as it's not on the teams to ensure that the dirty air is there, or that the dirty air is under control, it's never going to be fixed, because the engineers don't care about the dirty air. They just care about exploiting the aerodynamics. So I think push it back on the teams is the only solution. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And please do check out the other series we have on this channel, Storytime and Car Heroes, which come out every Sunday or Monday this week, because I was quite hungover. And I'll see you next week for another one. Leave your comments below. Don't forget to subscribe.